Hi everyone, and thanks for joining us today to talk about values-based leadership. For those of you who are familiar with our free breakfast events, today's webinar follows on from our recent events in Sydney and Melbourne. Indeed, today is a bit of an experiment for us. This is our first time running a live webinar, so please forgive us for any hiccups or speed bumps that we bump into along the way. And of course, if you're new to these events, then I'm sure any of those hiccups and speed bumps will no doubt seem a finely polished part of the show. Okay, look, before I get too far ahead of myself, a couple of introductions. My name is Ben Eastman. I'm a senior consultant at Voice Project, and indeed I've been at Voice for 10 years now in something of a tribute to our own company values and leadership. And look, our purpose at Voice Project is giving organisations a voice, or giving staff within organisations a voice, and trying to improve organisations. And we do that primarily through staff surveys, looking at engagement, leadership and customer satisfaction. We began back in 2002. We've been holding these sorts of events twice a year for about a decade now. So the reason we do that is to say a big thank you to many of our clients and to acknowledge some of the great work that our clients are doing. Like many of you, we've been very busy this year. We've grown quite a bit. We're now sitting at just over 20 staff. We've brought on 6 new people over the last year or so. And I have with me today our values-based leader, Dr. Peter Langford, and our speaker for today. In addition to leading Voice Project, Pete has been a senior lecturer in human resource management and director of the organisational psychology program at Macquarie University, a winner of the Macquarie University Innovation Award, and in some of the latest lists of achievements, and this is this year's winner of the Emerald Literati Award for Outstanding Paper for the publication of our empirically based Leadership 360 model and survey. Our topic today, of course, hardly needs an introduction. This year we've seen the failure of leaders to lead and live values in politics, religion, finance, sport, entertainment, the list goes on. I should also mention that if you have any questions during the presentation, then please send them through. We'll have a look through those as the presentation is going, and we'll try to address most of those at the end of the presentation. Also, our slides and video will be made available for download following the presentation, so stay tuned for those. And also, at the conclusion of the webinar, there will be an opportunity to provide some feedback. So we'll have a short feedback form for you to do that. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Pete and hand over for some great content on values-based leadership.
Right. Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'd like to start with a personal story. About a month ago, my eldest daughter, I have 2 daughters, my eldest daughter turned 18 and she's just finished the HSC here in New South Wales. Having now an adult daughter is one of those times that catches you a little in your life and makes you reflect. And so one of those reflections is I'm getting older. Another reflection is upon the leadership in society and how that will now have a bigger influence upon Jess than myself and my wife have had in recent years. And I can't help but feel a little disillusioned by a lot of the leadership failures that have happened in recent times. We've had 2 royal commissions on child abuse into the financial services. We've got another one coming up into aged care. We've had the revelations of the Me Too movements. We've had the ongoing difficulties of getting legislation around climate change and energy. We've had 5 PMs in Australia in the last 5 years. We may have another one in 6 months if you follow the polls. So a lot to be concerned about in terms of leadership. And all of those examples weren't failures of lack of strategic plans. They weren't failures of intelligence. They weren't failures of the amount of commitment and sacrifice that a lot of the leaders in those organisations have made. They were failures of values. They were failures of a mismatch between the values displayed by the leaders in the organisations and what society expects. I should say that I'm, on the whole, very optimistic that there's no point in civilization that I'd prefer to be living than now, but the improvement of leadership is a slow slog, and we've still got a lot of work to do. So hence the topic and I guess my personal connection and why I think it's an important one for society. So let me get into the slides. Ben mentioned Voice Project. If you don't know us, we are predominantly focused upon workplace surveys. So I'm going to start off with a survey question. Recently, we went out to 2,800 working-aged people in Australia, and we asked them this question: senior management behave in a way that is consistent with the values of this organisation? And we asked them, and I should say this was one of about 70 questions in the survey, we asked them to agree, disagree with that statement and all of the other statements. So for a moment, I'd like you to reflect on how you think your organisation would score on this particular. So what percentage of favourable responses would you get from your staff to this particular question: senior management behave in a way that is consistent with the values of this organisation? The score that we got back was 53%, and I'm just waiting for that to pop up on the screen. There we go. So 53% agree. That was across 2,800 staff. That in itself is a disappointing outcome, that only roughly half of the people that we had surveyed agreed that their leaders lived the values of their organisation. The other fascinating finding that we had was not only the low score, though, but the importance of this particular question. So flicking on to the next slides now. Here is a slide that shows the relative importance of that question, the first line there, values-based leadership, alongside the questions for a whole pile of other workplace practices that we ask. So we ask questions about recognition, involvement, processes, work-life balance and the like. And what we've done on this page is shown the relative importance, the impact of those practices upon the outcomes of how engaged staff were saying they were, their reported level of well-being, and their report of how well their organisation was performing. And this is based on correlations. If you're into your stats, the correlations range from about 0.45 to 0.7 on this slide. Now that question for values-based leadership across those three outcomes of engagement, well-being and performance was the strongest predictor compared to scores on all of the other questions in the survey. And there was about 70 questions in the survey. It gives you some sense that only 53% of staff were saying that their organisations do well on it, but it is the most important thing to get right in terms of an organisation setting itself up and having the leaders that are delivering upon the values of that organisation. All right, let's start with some definitions so we know what we're talking about. First definition, values. Generally, or simply, values are a belief in the importance of specific behaviours and outcomes. And it could be the value that you place on webinars or learning or reading or surfing. But I'll talk a lot about core values as part of this presentation. Essentially, core values are long-standing and particularly important values. Now, you may not use the term core values. It may be guiding principle, it may be a code, it may be packaged in a mission statement. And I'm not fussy about the definitions that you use. But that's what I'm going to be focusing upon, is these core, long-standing, particularly important values. And last one, values-based leadership, is a way of leading in which these core values play a central and explicit role in everyday decisions. And those two words there, central and explicit, are important. So it's core to the way people lead. It impacts much of the way that they behave in their decision-making. And explicit refers to, those values are included in everyday conversations and communications. All right, a little bit of the science behind values-based leadership. If you go back to the 60s, much of the leadership theory was about production and people. simple, and it wasn't too much more complicated than that. But then the 70s came along, and there was a lot of change. There was change in business. There was a lot more global competition. There was change in society. A lot of the civil rights legislations came through within the 70s. And leadership theory tried to catch up with that it's no longer just about production and people, it's also about change. So transformational leadership was about how leaders induce change in organisations. And a core part of that, if you follow the transformational leadership literature, is the central role of vision and values and the emotional connection that leaders have with individuals in trying to enact change. A similar time, there was Greenleaf, a great book, and there's been indeed a series of books and articles on it, on servant-based leadership. What he did was take the traditional pyramids. He was reacting against the hierarchy of much of leadership at the time, and he turned it on its head, and you've got this inverted pyramid as the typical image of servant leadership, where the leader is playing an empowering and service role for the rest of the organisation. Bloch took this one step further in terms of his theory of stewardship. So it wasn't just leadership as service for now, it was service for the future as well. So Bloch introduced a core concept of sustainability in leadership. We're not just building organisations delivering results now, we're doing it for the future. One of the criticisms of transformational leadership is you can have these charismatic leaders that promote the vision and values, but they often didn't walk the talk. So there was a movement which investigated authentic leadership. But a criticism of the authentic leadership literature was that you can be authentic but not necessarily ethical. So much of the leadership, and this is a big chunk of leadership research out there, is focused upon ethical leadership. And indeed, values-based leadership is closely related to that. It has been a way of trying to pull together all of these concepts from the focus on values and transformational leadership and involving all of these other practices. So it's a way of trying to encompass all of this research. Why is values-based leadership effective? Well, why shapes what. In this case, the what is the strategic plans, the decisions, the behaviours of individuals and the goals that we have within organisations. But behind all of those, there's always a why. There's always an assumption of what's important to focus upon. There's the values behind those goals and those strategic plans. And for a lot of organisations, if those values aren't explicit, if they're not conscious, maybe the goals, maybe the decisions, maybe the strategic plans aren't really what's important for that particular organisation. So a core part of why values-based leadership is effective is making those values explicit. Another reason it's effective is that values appeal to our more noble, aspirational nature. They appeal to the better angels within our nature. They're uplifting, more aspirational, more future-focused. Another reason is they're simply more efficient. So that as an individual, if I understand what the values are, then I don't need to spend as much time working out how to behave in a particular situation, under what criteria I'll make this decision or that decision. So they're more efficient for an individual in making decisions. But then also as a group, if you've got values if you've got individuals who understand their values, they're all working towards the same goals, that's going to allow alignment in the organisation. They're also efficient because they reduce conflict. A core part of values-based leadership is consideration for other stakeholders. It's not just focused upon the leader or a small team or a tribe around that leader. It's taking into account a broader range of stakeholders, customers, suppliers, community, government potentially. And to the extent that their needs are being taken into account when decisions are being made, then there's going to be less conflict further down the track. And a final aspect or final reason why it's effective is that a core concept or core feature of values-based leadership is that it's reflective, that it will constantly refer back on itself. Are these values appropriate? And values will evolve over time, and to the extent that there is that reflective nature of values-based leadership, it becomes self-correcting. Now I'll touch upon what values-based leadership isn't. Unfortunately, it's not the quickest way to achieve short-term gains. There will be times that, given the focus is upon the long term, you'll be making decisions that won't necessarily deliver the quickest outcomes, quickest goals. Values-based leadership is also not naive. A lot of people will think of values as being warm and fluffy, and that values-based leadership leaders will be naive, will be easy targets. Depending on the level that you're playing in leadership and the types of other leaders that you're interacting with, you still have to be at times quite politically astute, and you're going to be dealing with leaders who are not values-based leaders. So you need to have a very good understanding of how to work with them or how to manage the conflict that may be coming from them. Values-based leadership is also not a cure-all. It's a core foundation, it's a starting point, but you still need your strategic plans, you still need your processes, you still need your technology. Values-based leadership is not values prescriptive, so you can be Liberal, Labor, Green, you can be religious, you can be an atheist. Values-based leadership is not prescribing a narrow set of values in that sense. But having said that, it's also not values neutral. I've already mentioned some of the core aspects of values-based leadership: longer term, reflective, considerate of others, comes from an ethical background. All of those in some ways are values in and of themselves. So there are some values that, in a sense, you have to take as part of being a values-based leader. It's also not easy. As you'll see from a lot of, when we get into the practical aspects of how to roll this out, values-based leadership is a lifelong journey. You don't get there. And if you know the leaders that you greatly admire, those that are highly values-based, there's a constant self-reflection that are happening throughout their lives. It's happening on a maybe daily basis, and it's ongoing throughout their career and their stint as leaders. All right. Now, this is a workshop. I'd run these next few questions in a slightly different fashion, but I will get you to think through this as I'm working through it. And the first question that I'll throw at you is, what are your organisation's values? And can you now, if I were to ask you to write them down, could you actually explicitly write them down? And that begs the question of who can describe your values precisely. Are they something that quickly comes to mind? You as an employee of your organisation, can you quickly describe what the values are for your organisation? And if you can't, that begs the question of why. Potentially there aren't any values. Potentially they just changed and you don't know what the new ones are. Potentially they're there but no one communicates to them, so they're not fresh of mind. Or maybe they're there and they're just too complicated. So all of those start raising this issue of what should a core set of values look like for an organisation. Another important part is, if you're thinking about your core values in your organisation, to what degree do they really feel like yours? So if I rattled off a few values such as integrity, respect, collaboration, teamwork, I'm probably starting to tick quite a few of the core values of your organisations. They're great values, there's nothing wrong with them, but to the extent that you look at your values, and if you had multiple people in a room from other organisations and we were to mix up all the values, would we actually be able to clearly identify quickly which ones were yours? Do they actually feel like yours? I went to a presentation a couple of weeks ago by Fred Hollow's Foundation, and their focus is upon vision correction. And they had core values, I think they were, and I apologise if there's any Fred Hollow's folks out there, they were something like collaboration, integrity, maybe accountability and action, along those lines. And those words themselves aren't particularly unique, but what they did do, even though the words aren't unique, they packaged them in a way that was very Fred Hollow's. They put them, if you think of those eyesight tests that you do where you've got the larger letters up top and the smaller letters down the bottom, and that's how they presented their values. So they made them feel like Fred Hollow's values in the way that they were presented. Last one on this page is, what are your personal core values? In the same way that you can hopefully cite what your organisation's values are, can you also do it at a personal level? And when was the last time you actually wrote down or looked at any written down personal values? You can probably fairly quickly come up with some, and they might be things like family, there may be religion in there may be work. But to what degree have you actually gone through that process of thinking what your core values are? And then another thing to reflect upon is, what's the connection or even disconnect between your personal core values and your organisation's values, and what might be the implications of the level or lack of overlap between those? Another major problem with a lot of values, especially organisation values that we find, is that they aren't broad enough. So I want to talk a little bit about the Big Five. Based on the breakfast that we ran last week, I'd say about, a quarter or less of you have probably heard of the Big Five. But the Big Five is the most research and scientifically validated model of human behaviour. A couple of quick stats just to reinforce that. As of October, when I was preparing this presentation, I looked in a very well-known academic database. There were 5,740 peer-reviewed studies of the Big Five. Many of you, probably more of you, know about Myers-Briggs compared to the Big Five, but there were 9 times more studies on the Big Five than Myers-Briggs, and it gives you some sense of the presence of the Big Five. Unfortunately, the Big Five hasn't been packaged all that well. It's been a heavy research tool, but it hasn't been marketed and packaged that well outside of psychology. But the diagram on this page gives you some sense of what those 5 domains of human behaviour are. Now, the words that are in italics are the scientific terms, so extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, agreeableness, emotional stability. Maybe part of the problem of why it hasn't been marketed well is those terms aren't all that user-friendly. They're a little complicated, lots of syllables there. We, within Voice, and of course we've used some poetic license here, we've put our own little version of it, and you can see our terms there: voice, organise, innovate, connect, enjoy, as a way of thinking about those Big Five domains of human behaviour. And I'll flesh these out in a moment in the next couple of slides. I'll also highlight not only is voice one of the domains there, the first one, but it's also the acronym of the 5. So VOICE. So again, a little bit of poetic license that we've taken within Voice Project on those Big Five. To flesh that out a little bit, to give you a sense of what that Big Five is, here's a way that we have operationalised it with our 360 tool. So Ben mentioned before we recently won awards for outstanding paper. So that was for the development and publication of this tool, and I guess trying to encourage the use of the Big Five within leadership research a little more than what it currently is. And what we've put here around that Big Five, you'll see those other categories: vision, inspiration, quality, and the like. They are the competencies that are measured within our 360 tool. If you're interested in this particular paper, because it was an outstanding paper, Emerald Publishing have made it freely available for a year, and that was as of about mid-year. So I think we've got until about mid-next year. If you want to download the paper, you can just do a search for the reference that's on the top left of this slide. So Langford's Measuring Leader Behaviour, etc. And Cameron Dougal and Louise Parks are 2 other. Lou is still at Voice, and Cam's gone over to England now. Unfortunately, we've lost Cam. But yes, you can access that paper for free for at least another 6 months or so, I think. Here's the Big Five converted into values, and this is where it may be a little more relevant for this particular presentation. I label this as a worksheet, so the font's getting a little bit small, and I hope it's coming through the presentation reasonably well at your ends, but you can download this if you need to. Why this is relevant is that a lot of core values in organisations tend to be a little too narrow. They're not broad enough for the range of behaviour that occurs within organisations. And if I were to ask you, and this is a potential exercise for you post-webinar if you're interested, identify your values on this page or write down your values where you think they'd sit within this big five. And I would bet, based on experience, that a lot of your values fall within that connect section. That a lot of values that are developed within organisations tend to be quite people-focused, in part because a lot of organisations use a bottom-up approach to values. They're seen sometimes as a mechanism for engaging staff, so staff propose the values and staff are going to be more interested in things like teamwork, inclusion, integrity and the like. But the question for you is, to what extent do your values touch upon those other categories within the big five? So are there values within your organisation's core values that reflect some of those voice values or organisation values, innovate values or enjoy values? One thing that we are seeing in recent years is the greater inclusion of things like well-being, so coming from that enjoy category, getting their way into values. But one area that's often missed is innovate, which is curious given the core role of innovation in almost all organisations, but innovate doesn't make itself into a lot of organisations' core values. Next few slides cover off a few examples. So I'm going to put ours out there. These are Voice Project's core values. So we've been using these for a long time. They were developed prior to Ben even coming on board when we were a smaller group, but it was all of us getting together, coming up with these values. And I present it to give you a flavour, not to harp on too much about our particular values, but to give it a flavour for, you don't just want to come up with the core words for your values, but you also want to operationalise or put them in very behavioural terms. So that's what we've done here with Voice Project's values. Again, we've just gone straight with the big five. You'll see them there: voice, organise, innovate, connect, enjoy. Again, it works well with us, the poetic licence around the acronym of voice, so it feels voicey very much. And we've gone and put a tagline behind each of the values. So voice is express and strive towards your vision and values. And then we've come up with some core behaviours that I guess best exemplify the values. So that's the type of process you want to go through. Once you've identified what those core values are in terms of key words, you want to flesh them out a little and then package them like this in a way that has meaning, some kind of emotional connection to your staff. And yours shouldn't look like this, so you shouldn't take the big five, or at least not explicitly like that. They need to feel like you and your organisation. Here's a great example. It's an interesting example also because they don't necessarily follow all the ideal rules of what a value statement should be like. This comes from Hammond Care. We've been working with Hammond Care for 16 years. Hammond Care is one of the most values-driven organisations that I know. Have a lot of respect for Hammond Care. Within the downloadable resources that are attached to the webinar, there is a question and answer session that I held with Stephen Judd, who's the CEO of Hammond Care, and asked him a bunch of questions about what are the values, how did you come up with them, what does it look like living those values in your organisation. So have a look at that Q&A. It's a 4-page document, some really nice answers there. But I guess what I want to highlight here is how Hammond Care has operationalised those values. Now, I would typically say that the number of values that you should have should be something around 5, 4, 5, 6, that type of thing is usually what you'd settle on. Hammond Care have actually put down 16, so the orange lines are probably the closest thing to their values. They also just don't talk the language of values. They talk about their mission. And as I said, there's 16 of them, but you can see how they've outlined them, they've operationalised them. For a lot of organisations, this wouldn't work well because it'd be a document that would sit on a shelf or sit on a wall and no one would pay attention to it. It would be too complicated. But within Hammond Care, they use this extensively. So it's a document that's involved regularly in communication. This notion of mission in action is common language within Hammond Care. So they carry this off really well because it's a core part in all their communication and decision making. Another example to touch upon is from City of Ryde. Now, in some ways for Hammond Care, you kind of expect an organisation that has a religious background, so it's a Christian-based charity, they're a not-for-profit. You kind of expect them to be a little more values-oriented than maybe a local council. But City of Rydes are outperforming the council benchmark that we have. So we work with quite a lot of councils. City of Ryde noticeably outperform the council benchmark in terms of staff believing in their values and the organisation living the values. So hence including a Q&A in the pack as well on City of Ryde. And the image that you're seeing on this slide is actually a desktop for their computer. So it's an example of a way of communicating values to staff. You can see the values on the right-hand side of the slides. They've got a little tagline attached to each of those values. And if I were to apply that big five to those values, I'd say, well, there's a few areas in that big five that are not being covered off. But what they do, interestingly, if you look at the words on the bottom of the slide, they actually do start covering off on a lot of those areas in the big five with those extra little explanations along the bottom. All right. So that's a lot about understanding core values. Now I want to get onto the leadership side of things. The Edelman Trust Barometer Edelman is a public relations agency in the US, but they do this great bit of research. Every year they go out to 33,000 members of the public and across 28 organisations, so it's a bit over 1,000 people per, 28 countries, a bit over 1,000 people per country. So it's this big global study. The results that I'm showing here are from Australia, so it was something like 1,200 or thereabouts Australians that took part in this particular study. To the question about whether or not the respondents trusted institutions to do the right thing. These are the percentage of people who answered 5 to 9 on a 9-point rating scale. Only 31% of respondents trusted media. And of course this would vary across different journalists or different media outlets, but on average 31% trust the media. 35% trust government, 45% trust business, 48% trust NGOs. I was a little surprised by the NGOs. I thought that would be well above halfway. But it gives you some sense of the lack of trust in institutions and leaders these days. They also asked the question, the credibility of information coming from different leaders, different individuals out there. Only 28% said they found information from journalists credible, 30% from government officials, 39% from CEOs, and 63% from academics. I'm going to hold on to the fact that I'm a past academic, so hopefully I'm a little closer to that larger number. But even so, all of those numbers, again, you can see that trust factor is quite low. And then they asked the question, of these 4 major institutions, which one is most broken? And the interesting answer to this was a forced choice. You could only choose one of them, but 56% of people said that government was most broken. And note that government wasn't the lowest scoring one, but I think it reflects the fact that people have fairly high expectations of the level of values and the service that they would expect to receive from government. Given that lack of trust, here are what I think are some of the major failures of values in leaders in a lot of organisations. First one, short-term focus, and this is what a lot of businesses are criticised for. It's focus upon the short-term earnings report rather than the longer-term sustainability or the longer-term effectiveness of the products and services that are being delivered. Another failure is the egocentricity of a lot of leaders. They're in it for themselves rather than in it for their organisations or in it for their customers. A lot of leaders are also quite narrow-minded. If we go back to that notion of the big 5, they might be focusing upon one particular thing. It might be upon delivery of performance, for example, and not upon the connection side or not upon innovation and the like. So quite a narrow focus. Within Australia, we've had the issue around ball tampering, and if I have time, I'll mention a case study and the report that came out into the investigation of the ball tampering in Cricket Australia. And a core part of the problem where is a very narrow focus upon winning. It was winning at all costs, or as they say in the report, winning but being oblivious to what the costs are. Another problem is the values can be concealed. Either they can be unconscious to the leader, they're just not aware of what their values are, or they're aware but they're not putting it out on the table for others to be aware of. And this, a series that I love and I'm watching a lot is House of Cards, but constantly thinking when I'm watching House of Cards is what's really the motive here? They just said that, they had that conversation, they've just done that, but what really was the motive? There's that assumption now that leaders are often quite concealed with what their real motives are. Another failure of a leadership is inconsistency, and it's a core example that it's just not walking the talk. They'll say one thing but do another thing. Or it can just be inconsistency arising from a lack of insight, that they don't see themselves in the same way that others see themselves. Another major problem is the defensiveness of leaders, often avoiding evaluations from others, or when there is some kind of feedback that they receive, there's a hostile reaction to that. And final one, divisive. And if you have two leaders who are adopting a very divisive approach in their arguments, it kind of comes down to who can rage the loudest. And it becomes this shouting match. It's like those fun but slightly disappointing times when you see Parliament and all they're doing is yelling at each other across either sides rather than actually achieving some good legislation. So if those are the failures, what are the ideals that we want to see in leaders? Well, we want to see a longer-term focus. And as I said, that's a core concept in values-based leadership. It's focused upon the longer term, even if at times that might mean there's some short-term sacrifices. Another ideal is that they are empowering. They're not just focused upon themselves, or they're not just focused upon one's immediate tribes, that they are taking into account a much wider range of stakeholders and trying to support as much as possible that wider group of people. We want them to be broad-minded, and if I go back to that big five, we want them to be thinking about all of those domains. It's not just performance for today, it's not just having a great vision, but it's also keeping in mind innovation. It's also keeping in mind a lot of the connection, the people side of things. It's keeping in mind the well-being side of things. We want them to be transparent. It's a core concept in a lot of ethical theory and a lot of the research around ethical leadership is transparency. Of course, there are times when you can't be completely transparent, but the goal is to be as transparent as possible. We want them to be authentic. Touched upon that as being a core part of leadership. In and itself, it's not sufficient, but we want them to walk the talk. We want them to have good insight into who they are and how others see them. We want them to be reflective, and true values-based leaders will be constantly reflecting upon their values to the extent that it's a daily or near-daily activity that they are thinking values, and that there's also more formal mechanisms for evaluating, not necessarily specifically on values. It could be more broadly through employee surveys, it could be other performance indicators that you have in your organisations, but all of them are interpreted or can be interpreted in terms of what does that reflect about my values and where I'm putting my priorities. And finally, we want values-based leaders to be inclusive. It's not this divisive who can yell the loudest. There is a genuine openness to negotiation and compromise is not necessarily a bad outcome. You may not be able to achieve it all the time, and there may be some values clashes, but there's a genuine desire to try to resolve those values clashes. So, again, if this was a workshop, I'd run this in a slightly different way and we'd spend a bit of time on this slide. I hope you can see the font. It's getting a bit small, but this is a worksheet rather than a PowerPoint presentation slide. So if you can print this out, print it out on A4 or even A3 and you can discuss this amongst your colleagues. What we've got here are those undesirable but also desirable aspects of values-based leadership. And this essentially, I've turned this into a maturity scale. So the small fonts, the left-hand side shows those, it's those descriptors that we just saw a couple of slides ago on what not values-based leadership looks like. And then on the right-hand side, we've got all of those ideals. And then I've also put a midpoint in there as well to give you some sense of how to score it. Now, if you were to use this in your teams, I'd say yourself, if you're reflecting on your own leadership, or for groups of people that you could sit down and think through, how do our leaders score on this particular maturity scale? So I've put in a 5-point scale there. You could score yourself out of 5 on each of those characteristics of leadership. Now, I should say you're not going to score 5 on each of these. So if you were to add the scores across 7 of these characteristics, you're not going to score 35. That's like the ideal, but hopefully you're nudging towards it. Hopefully you're scoring somewhere around the 3s and then occasionally delivering on the getting into the 4 and 5 range as well. So as I mentioned before, values-based leadership is not easy. If you're doing this process, this analysis at an individual level, you're going to bounce around in terms of performing really well as a values-based leadership at times, but other times just missing it. But hopefully we're pushing towards the right-hand side of this particular page. So as I said, worksheet for you to be able to step through either at an individual level or a group level and post this presentation. So, if that gives us some sense of what we want in values-based leadership, how do we deliver it? What's the practical aspect of delivering upon this? There are 2 core stages you're going to go through. The first one is coming up with what these values are, and we've touched upon this a little already in the webinar. So you want to reflect and agree upon the desired core values for your organisation. Many of you may have gone through this process. You may not need to repeat the process. You may have your values in place already, in which case you'd skip to the second major stage, which is embedding those core values in the work practices. And I'll expand upon both of these in a moment. But a core part that I want to emphasise on this slide is this is a cycle. You don't just do the values once and come up with them and then try to embed them. You need both of these. You don't just come up with the values and put them on a wall. If they're not embedded in your values, then they won't be lived. They won't be carried out by the leaders. But once you've done this, every once in a while you need to go back and reflect upon what those values are. And values should evolve. Either you may change what those core words are, the 4, 5, 6 words within the values, or perhaps more frequently, you're going to change the way that you live those values. So the taglines or even the behavioural descriptors of those values. You're going to evolve those over time. And values are a reflection of your particular personality and the background to you, your organisation, your history. So values are going to change as the nature of your organisation changes. As you get bigger, as you start engaging in more markets, deliver different types of products, the values may change. So they should evolve. There should be this reflective nature. So let's have a look at what you can do in terms of reflecting and acting upon these desired core values. I like throwing in some cartoons. You've seen a few already, which I haven't directly referenced, but hopefully you've had a chance to read them. But I will dwell on this one a little bit. If you ever want an example of what not to do in organisations, Dilbert's really good. So here we have the pointy-haired boss of Dilbert coming up with their core values. And of course, not getting it right. 10 of our finest executives got together and created a statement of our core values. And hopefully you're already picking up one of the major problems behind what he's done here in terms of just getting those 10 executives. You get 10 executives together, and maybe with the intention of the pointy-haired boss and the other types of executives that live in Dilbert world, you come up with a statement, something like this. We help the community and the world by producing state-of-the-art business solutions. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's completely empty. And of course, you come up with a statement or core values that look something like that, and then you get the typical response from employees who are going to be cynical about the process. And they're not going to end up living those values. It's going to have no meaning to them. If anything, you've actually done the organisation a disservice and some damage by going through that process. So, what do you do to get it right? Well, the first thing that the pointy-haired boss didn't do, of course, was have an inclusive approach. It was confined to the executives. You need an inclusive and also a divergent first stage for coming up with your core values. So, inclusive is all parts of the organisation, from the front line, from the more junior staff in the organisation, all the way up to the executives. And one group that often gets missed in putting together core values is the boards. The board's got to be part of this. I've seen organisations that will have core values put in place. There'll be effective core values. The CEO of the organisation leaves, the board appoints someone else who comes in with a different set of core values, and it all gets wiped. So if it's not starting, or at least involving the board in that process, if they're not on board with those values, then the values that the organisation itself and the staff can come up with will often get thrown out. And then if you go through this cycle of creating new values all the time, people get cynical about the process. So it has to be inclusive from the very bottom all the way up to the top, including the board. Now, if you were going through this process, this could take a year going through this process, but you'd have some workshops, some town hall meetings with your staff. And these are the types of questions that you'd ask as part of that process. What are our espoused values? So what are the values that we say are important in this organisation? Another one is, what are the enacted values, which can often be very different to what are the espoused ones. What we say and what we do can be quite different, but putting those on the table and making them explicit is an important part in terms of coming up with what your core values are. What goals, activities and outcomes give us the most energy and fulfilment? This can be a useful question at a personal level as well if you're trying to come up with your core values. The things that excite you the most, that give you the greatest sense of satisfaction, are often an indicator that they're tapping into some of your core values. Other questions such as, what do we admire in others? What are the strong and unique features of our character, our context and our history? As I said, values will differ across people and organisations because people and organisations differ. Use the big five that we've gone through to make sure that there aren't possibilities or domains of behaviour that you're not covering off within your values. Involve all staff and the board, I've touched upon that. And then once you've gone through that divergent phase, you want to start converging. And this can be through some kind of mechanism of surveying or voting on shortlisted values. This could be an electronic approach, or it could be done within these forums, within the focus groups and town hall meetings, that you have some kind of voting system there as well to try to nut down. So you can see from this, we've gone wide, we've involved lots of people, and now we're involving lots of people in trying to nut down on what the small set of values are for the organisation. After that, I mentioned before that you don't just want your 5 words or whatever they might be, but you want to be able to flesh these out and put them in more operational terms, more behavioural terms. Often that's going to be hard when you're trying to do it with a lot of people. So you'll probably have a representative group that then will come up with a draft of what some example behaviours are. And then there might be some iterative process where they're communicated out, fed back, some changes made. And finally, you want to package these in a way. If you go back to like that Hammond Care example that I had before, their mission and then their mission in action, it was packaged in a nice way. And that document is regularly distributed and it's placed in prominent places in the organisation. I mentioned the Fred Hollows one where they packaged it in a way that looked very vision-oriented. So you want to have an emotional connection. You can do that by the visual presentation of those values. So that's one slide covering off what may take a year in terms of an initiative in trying to come up with core values for your organisation. But once you've come up with those core values, we need to embed them. And you need to embed them in terms of the recruitment system. So those criteria that you use when you're recruiting people, and again, it's not just recruiting frontline staff, it's recruiting executives and even board members. To what degree is the language of values used in the way that you're choosing people? Is it embedded in your processes, your decision frameworks, the way that you engage in audits within the organisation? Are values a core part of that? To what degree are values used in the way that you orient people? When people come on board for the first time, within their first day or week, are they clearly told what the values are? And would they, at the end of that week, be able to cite back what the values are? Also, the other development opportunities, ongoing development opportunities in organisations. The feedback, the day-to-day informal conversations and the more formal evaluations in organisations, to what degree do they highlight the values and are people being evaluated against those values? The recognition, the thanks that occur within the workplace, any of the awards programs. Often awards programs are a really neat way of communicating and highlighting values, and you can package your awards programs around those values. The way that you correct people. Do people feel a level of psychological safety within your organisations to call out behaviour that's not in line with the values? And to what degree are there mechanisms for people for grievances, or worst case for whistleblowing in the organisation? And to what degree are they accepted, and is there a good process around it as opposed to quite a defensive reaction to those types of complaints? To what degree are the people who are promoted in your organisation reflective of your values? Because if of course, they become the executives, they become the leaders and the role models for other staff. And finally, to what degree are values regularly included in the communications, in executive updates, in the posters, and of course the behaviour of people. Role modelling is one of the most powerful forms of communication. So, again, one page, but that's a way of trying to put the practical aspect of how we embed this. All right, so I mentioned before the Cricket Australia case study. I'm guessing that no one out there has actually read this report, but to Cricket Australia's credit, they went through this process, an evaluation by the Ethics Centre, and they've produced this report, and they've publicly released the report. What's the ironic part of this, if you have read the report, is unfortunately there are chunks on it that are redacted. There's these big chunks of black on various pages. Now, given that this was an ethics issue and they've produced a report and they've gone through the process of making it transparent, it's kind of disappointing that there's clearly bits that they're holding back on that they didn't want the public to be aware of. But nevertheless, the report is a good example of the types of ways that they have recommended that Cricket Australia, and indeed the more general cricket community, has or should try to embed values and ethics in the way that they engage their practice. And I've put a few up there on that slide. One example, the third bullet point there, awards to consider behaviour in line with values. We have, within Australia, we have the Allan Border Medal, but it's based predominantly on performance. The recommendation was it should be both performance and the values-based behaviour of those individuals. Also, recommendations around giving umpires the ability to rate teams and to warn and even ban players based on their code of conduct. So, an interesting case study when it comes to trying to embed values, behaviour within an organisation. All right, I'm coming to the end. Here are some readings, if you're interested. Down towards the bottom, we've got a couple of academic readings. I also included some references a little bit earlier on that, the sort of scientific history of values-based leadership, if you want to read up on that. But if there's one thing you wanted to read, one source, I'd probably go for that first one by Freeman and Oster, Bridging the Values Gap. I found that the most powerful and sort of insightful book for values-based leadership. So have a go at that one. All right, I'm going to wrap up. As the slide here suggests, 30 tips for values-based leadership in 60 seconds. This is going to take a little bit longer than 60 seconds, but my main point is I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. There's going to be 30 tips. I don't expect you to put all of them in place, but if you did one or two of these things, then I'm a happy boy coming out of this. So let's go through this process and see how close I can get to 60 seconds. You won't be perfect. You're going through this process, practice self-compassion. Lock time away in your calendar for self-reflection. Start a values journal. Even if you don't start a values journal, at least write down your personal values. Use the Big Five to consider broadening the values. Guess what others would say your values are, and if you have the courage, ask them. Consider what values lie behind your goals. As I mentioned before, why shapes what. Often we have a lot of whats, but we aren't necessarily aware of what the why is, what the values are behind those. For 30 days, score yourself on how well you lived your values. Do a 360 survey. It's going to be confronting, but front up to it and see what others think about yourself. Relax and listen, and don't defend when others provide feedback. Talk about values more at work, but also at home. Identify where you don't walk the talk. So a little bit of self-insight about where you're not delivering on your values. Study the values you struggle with the most. Read books on those particular values or people who deliver on those values. Read autobiographies of leaders with values you admire. Post your values in places you'll see regularly. Have a guess at what others value. Open yourself to others' values. Dip your toes in their world. Read some of their books. Do something that's a little bit different to what you normally do. Go a little lighter on enforcing your values on others. Reflect on what you'd like others to say about your values when you die. Fess up to yourself and others when you don't live your values. Say sorry more often. Say thanks more often. Every day, recognise at least one thing that you're grateful for. Understand what derails you from living your values. Give yourself hearty praise when you live your values. We're so good at whacking ourselves when we don't live the values. We're not so great at actually recognising when we do. At least once a year, reflect on how your values, or at least the way that they need to turn into behaviours, should evolve. Accept that you'll often fail to live your values, but get good at picking yourself up and putting yourself back on track. Don't take yourself too seriously, laugh at yourself a bit more, and accept that values-based leadership is a lifelong journey. Okay, I'm done. I'll hand over to a few questions. We've got 5 minutes or so.
Thanks, Steve. A lot of people have asked about access to the content. There should be a button on the bottom right of your screen to download the slides that we've gone through. Also, we will be making available at a later date a copy of the video itself, so keep an eye on our website for that. A few people have asked about our 360 tool and can they see an example of it. Again, if you have a look at our website, there is a section there where we've got a sample of the tool and some sample reports as well. The article that was referred to, that won the Emerald Literati Prize, that's available through Emerald Literati at the moment. But you'll also find a research section on our website that contains links and content with all of the freely available research that we've been involved in. One of the questions that came through, and I think you touched on this briefly, Pete, in your slides, was can a company change its values over time? Indeed, should it change its values over time?
Yeah, absolutely. They should change, but to the extent that they were well-designed values initially, then it should be a process of evolution. Values need to have some emotional connection. People need to buy into them, and to the extent that they've done that, then you don't want to throw in a completely different set of values. So people will be attached to, there'll be some level of ownership on those values. So they should evolve. Often organisations will go through like a 5-year plan for changing their strategic direction. They'll come up with the new strategic plan, and maybe that's a process as well for reflecting upon what the values are and whether or not they're appropriate. And it's probably inevitable that you get new general managers, new CEOs on boards, and they're going to want to put their mark on the organisation. So to that extent, new people come on board. Hopefully they'll evolve values rather than completely rip up the old ones and put in new ones.
Yeah. Also, quite often values are developed from a bottom-up perspective. What can organisations do to make sure that that bottom-up process aligns with the values that are coming from top down?
Yeah, and I had that question coming out of one of the breakfasts. Essentially, the manager, general manager, said board's actually given him a directive of what the values should be. Now, clearly that's problematic as well. It's going back a little bit to that Dilbert cartoon where you don't want it to be completely top-down, but you do want an indication from the board about what they see as appropriate values. And there may be some priorities for an organisation over the next 5 years or so. So the board might give an indication of what the values should be or vaguely what they should look like. So to make sure that all of those groups have input is literally ask them all. And then maybe when you're starting that town hall presentation with staff where you're getting their input, you may well give some feedback about what the board expects out of this. And it's not saying this is what is going to be the outcome, but these are some of the priorities that we think are important for the organisation in the years to come.
Okay, thanks. Also, quite often, particularly in large organisations, you might have different parts of the organisation have different values. Either the sales department might have one set, the production department might have another set, or indeed across different cultures or countries as well.
Yes.
How do you manage that sort of situation?
Yeah. How do you manage it? Again, you don't want to completely rip up people's values if there's been a lot of effort that's gone into the creation of those. But having said that, you also don't you want a consistent language across the organisation. So ideally, you will come up with a set of values that the entire organisation uses, but you may have different ways that you flesh that out. So in terms of the descriptions of behaviour attached to each of those values, then maybe that looks different for sales than it does for production, or maybe it looks different in Australia than it does in the Philippines, for example. So you still have your core set. That's the ideal if you can get there, but you may sort of turn it into or describe different behaviours behind those. I see that we're hitting 1 o'clock.
We are pretty close. I think the only question you had remaining was around how do we convince our executives to review our values? How do we get that happening?
Yeah. Well, it may come up through an employee survey, for example. So build in some questions within your employee surveys about to what degree your organisations are living your values. You can include that question that we included right up front: to what degree do managers live our values? And that in itself might highlight the lack of them. You can also ask questions such as, if you have your values, you can ask a question such as, to what degree are we living our value of X? And you could do that 5 times if you've got 5 values. And that might be a prompt. Otherwise, I guess it's highlighting what the downsides and what the risks are. And maybe some of these examples of failures of leadership that we've come across, the Royal Commissions and the like, Cricket Australia example, are some examples that may have some traction with an executive in trying to describe that these are the risks, this is what can happen if we're not engaging in this kind of activity. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Look, if that brings us to an end, if anyone's interested in us running this presentation in your own organisation, then get in touch with us. Likewise, if you want any more information on any of the material we've presented, then please let us know. Otherwise, thanks for joining us, and I hope that was helpful.
All right,
Cheers.
Thanks. See ya.